The desk they gave me was in a side corridor on the fourth sublevel of the Veltaris Civic Academy. It was technically a desk, a flat surface bracketed to the wall between a ventilation housing and a corridor junction post, but I think alcove ledge would have been more accurate. There was no chair. The Veltaris don't sit the way we do, so I dragged a supply crate over on the first morning, and nobody said anything about it. Nobody said very much to me at all, those first few days. That seemed fine. I was there on an interspecies exchange fellowship, 12 weeks, covering the Academy's spring administrative cycle. The program had been running for 6 years. I was the fourth human to go through it. The briefing packet from the previous fellows said, more or less, bring comfortable shoes and something to write with, because the Veltharis will not offer you either. I brought 2 spiral notebooks and a box of mechanical pencils. The Veltaris faculty considered this charming. I overheard one of the senior registrars describe my notebooks to a colleague as souvenir paper artifacts, in the same tone a person might use for a child who insists on carrying a stuffed animal to school. The Veltaris are a civil service species. This is the kindest way I know to put it. They have 17 words for committee, and no word at all for intuition. Their academy trains the administrative officers who run the Veltharis Civic Directorate, intake clerks, census coordinators, resource flow analysts, inter-coalition liaison staff, and the place runs like a very large, very slow clock. Everything is assessed, everything is filed, everything is cross-referenced and audited, and then filed again in a different format. They find this deeply satisfying. I found it fascinating. The exchange program required 2 things from each participant. The hosting institution was required to file a capability assessment of the student at the end of the fellowship, a standard form, 4 pages, covering language aptitude, procedural comprehension, and social integration. The student was required to file an institutional assessment of the host, a different form, also 4 pages, covering facility adequacy, instructional quality, and administrative transparency. I had read both forms carefully before I left Earth. The Veltaris had apparently not read either of them in some time, because when I asked the senior registrar on my second day where I might submit my preliminary observation notes, she blinked at me for a long moment and said they would handle all the paperwork on my behalf. I thanked her and went back to my supply crate. The preliminary cognitive baseline survey started on the 3rd day. This was their term for it, not mine. The Veltharis faculty had apparently decided that before they could properly document my socialization progress, they needed to establish where I was starting from. One of the junior assessment officers, a precise, narrow-shouldered fellow named Velkorath Den, who wore his credentials on a sash and seemed to genuinely enjoy clipboards, arrived at my alcove ledge with a set of standardized questions. They were the kind of questions designed to find out whether a subject can count, follow instructions, and identify basic hierarchical relationships. He read them to me with enormous patience and wrote down my answers with a stylus. I answered them all correctly. He seemed mildly surprised. He came back the next day with a second set, slightly harder. I answered those too. He filed his notes, thanked me for my cooperation, and told me the faculty would continue monitoring my integration over the coming weeks. I said that sounded very thorough. In the meantime, I observed. My alcove ledge, as it turned out, was not a bad place to observe from. The 4th sublevel of the Veltharis Civic Academy was where the working administrative offices were, the ones that actually ran the place, as opposed to the upper floors, which were mostly lecture halls and ceremonial chambers. The corridor junction beside my desk connected to the staff canteen, the records annex, the inter-coalition liaison office, and the emergency resource routing center. Faculty, clerks, assessors, and departmental heads walked past me all day. Most of them eventually stopped noticing I was there. I was the human exchange student on the supply crate. I wrote things in my notebook. That was apparently all they expected me to do. I wrote things in my notebook. The canteen was where I learned the most. The Veltharis eat at fixed intervals, and they talk while they eat. Not casually, but in the way people talk when they have forgotten to modulate their volume because they have been in the same building with the same colleagues for 11 years. I heard about the budget shortfall in the Census Coordination Office and the 3-year backlog in the Intercoalition Liaison queue, and the ongoing dispute over whether the emergency resource routing protocols were compliant with the revised Civic Directorate standards from 2 administrations ago. I heard who had filed a grievance against whom. I heard which departments were actually functional, and which ones were held together by 2 clerks, who were both planning to retire in the spring. I wrote it all down in my second notebook, because my first was full by the end of week 2. Velkorath Den came back every few days with new assessment questions. The questions kept getting harder, and I kept answering them. By week 6, I think he had genuinely started to enjoy our sessions. He would arrive with his clipboard and a slightly anticipatory expression, like a man who has brought a puzzle he suspects the other person will solve. I liked him. He was meticulous and kind, and he always told me which department had filed the questions, which was useful information. The last question on his week 9 session was, does the subject demonstrate a capacity for institutional analysis? He read it to me, stylus ready. I said I thought so. I offered to provide a sample. He wrote that down. By week 11, I had filled 3 notebooks, cross-referenced the canteen transcripts against the budget documents I had been handed in error on 2 separate occasions by overworked clerks who mistook me for someone else, and mapped the functional reporting structure of 9 departments against the official org chart, which turned out to be substantially different from how things actually ran. The Emergency Resource Routing Center, for instance, reported officially to the Senior Deputy Director, but in practice operated as a fully autonomous unit because the Senior Deputy Director had not attended a routing briefing in 14 months. This was not a secret, everyone knew it. It had simply never been written down in one place. I wrote it down. The institutional assessment form allowed 4 pages. I had considerably more than 4 pages of material. The fellowship guidelines specified that additional annexes could be submitted as supplementary documentation at the student's discretion. I submitted the assessment form and 43 pages of annexes. The whole package came to 47 pages. I filed it through the Intercoalition Liaison Office on a Wednesday morning, because that was the correct submission channel according to the program charter, and because the Intercoalition Liaison Office was 6 steps from my alcove ledge. The clerk who received it counted the pages twice. The faculty response came on the Thursday of my last week. The senior registrar called me into her office, which was on the 3rd sublevel and had a proper chair, which she indicated I should use. She sat across from me with the 47 pages on her desk. She had tabbed it. There were a lot of tabs. She asked me how I had obtained certain figures from the Census Coordination Office. I said they were in the quarterly summary that the census coordinator had left in the canteen on the 14th day of my fellowship, which I had borrowed, read, and returned to the rack beside the beverage dispenser. She asked about the routing center analysis. I said I had been listening to the routing center morning briefings, which were conducted in the open corridor adjacent to my desk, every day for 11 weeks. There was a pause. She asked if I had found my alcove ledge comfortable. I said the crate was a little low, but I had managed. She looked at the tabs for a moment, then she looked at me, then she looked at the tabs again. The capability assessment they filed on my behalf was submitted the following Monday. 4 pages, standard form. It noted that I had demonstrated adequate socialization and a strong interest in institutional documentation. Under notable aptitudes, someone had written, observational persistence. I thought that was fair. The fellowship program coordinator, back on Earth, asked me how I had found the Veltaris Civic Academy. I told her it was well worth attending. I said the faculty were thorough, the administrative culture was genuinely interesting, and the corridor acoustics on the 4th sublevel were excellent. She asked if I would recommend it to the next fellow. I said absolutely. I said bring a pencil and an extra notebook. She asked why 2. I said 1 usually isn't enough. She sent that part to the program board. They're revising the packing list. I don't know what the Veltaris did with all 47 pages. I do know that within a month of my departure, the Census Coordination Office had its budget shortfall formally acknowledged, and the Emergency Resource Routing Center was given its own official reporting line in the org chart. Velkarath Den sent me a message 4 months later. He said the faculty had found my assessment comprehensive, if unconventionally sourced. They had updated the program intake documentation to clarify that the student institutional report was a mandatory deliverable, not optional. He said they were looking forward to the next fellow. I wrote back and told him I hoped they gave the next one a proper chair. He replied that they had already ordered one. Small courtesies tell you the most about a place.